Can somebody speak?
No.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. It is Friday, and this is the third in our installments related to the LA fires. I'm Mark Roberts. I'm a member of the California Planning Roundtable. And today we have another very interesting webinar. We're going to take about an hour today, including questions. We're going to hear from our two panelists after they're introduced. And then there will be time for questions, so you can put those into the chat. And then Rob will take a look at those and draw some that seem to be related back to what we're talking about. And we'll wrap up our discussion at about 2 o'clock this afternoon. And this webinar, along with the previous ones, will be available on the APA website. So Rob, do you want to take it away and do introductions?
Great, thanks, Mark. And we're going to wrap it at 3.
That's true, because we're an hour later. We are wrapping it
Yeah.
3 o'clock.
That's right. So I'm Rob Olshansky. I'm a researcher in resilience and disaster planning. I'll be the moderator today. And so the purpose of this panel, most of the public discussion to date on LA's recovery process is focused on the need for rapid cleanup and reconstruction. And a lot of the media pieces, as well as a lot of public comments by officials, have been suggesting that we need to make a choice between either doing rapid reconstruction or doing community improvement, that we really can't do both. And so the purpose of this webinar is to respond to this overly simple, very linear model of disaster recovery and identify ways in which planners can help. Recovery is really a more dynamic process, and there's multiple opportunities for planning and planners at a variety of scales to positively influence both the speed and the quality of the community that's going to arise. So we're fortunate to have with us 2 experienced professionals who will describe some of the ways in which communities can influence their recovery trajectories and create better futures. And we hope that the listeners, we hope that you'll see roles for yourselves in the coming months as planners who can help these communities to do just that. So we're going to begin with Lori Johnson, FAICP, who has worked for 30 years in disaster recovery and catastrophe risk management, both in the US and internationally. And so she's going to start by briefly sharing with us some of the major planning lessons from that work. And after that, we'll have Jennifer Gray Thompson from After the Fire USA, and she's going to describe her work in helping wildfire communities share their knowledge in supporting locally led recoveries. They'll each have about 10 minutes. We'll have moderated discussion. I'll give them some questions, and then after that, we'll take your questions from the Q&A. So with that, Lori.
Thanks, Rob, and hi, everybody. Hi, Jennifer. We had a brief planning session on this, and so hopefully we'll execute according to what the 3 of us had discussed. I did prepare some slides, so let me load those up real quick. And as Rob said, what I wanted to do was just briefly kind of put the idea of planning into context with some theory, with some thoughts about, and just really letting you know how the governance and the operations are structured for disaster recovery, and then what does that mean for planning. So first thing from a theoretical point of view is one of the things Rob and I really wanted to understand, especially in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, was why was urban planning, what we do as planners, so different in a post-disaster environment? And we call that time compression. The idea that all those urban and development activities now have to take place, that took many, many years and decades to create a special place like Altadena or Pacific Palisades, now has to be condensed in time and space. And that's really because of the simultaneous loss of so many different assets and services. But the place of disaster becomes different from other places in new ways. In particular, one of the things is that the activities don't compress in time equally. So things get out of sync. and look to be out of order in sometimes. In New Orleans, people would often say that the money to do the mitigation and elevate their house wasn't there yet, so they were building the second floor before the first floor. That's the kind of stuff that you have to work on to get in sync with disasters, and that's what creates a challenge when you're trying to do any form of change. The second thing is that cities, as we know as planners, are complex adaptive systems and self-organizing. And so there is an ecosystem of recovery actors. And so you have to really motivate and stimulate and feed information to those actors. So money is one of the fuels of disaster recovery, but so is information. And the other thing, and this is sort of how we've begun to talk about this at the national level, at least, is to talk about recovery as a set of overlapping phases that progress over time, but also a set of activities or projects. You will hear a lot in the jargon of government about recovery projects and recovery action plans, like us for community development block grants. So breaking everything down into projects. That also becomes challenging if you're trying to do policy and visioning and thinking about change. This is one of the first, a timeline from one of the first researchers who looked at long-term reconstruction. And they talked about a process being ordered and knowable and very structured. Rob and I use this in our book, After Great Disasters, not so much to say that, yes, it is ordered and structured and knowable like this, but to also point out one of the things that they noted, which we believe has held up over time, which is that each phase of recovery takes exponentially longer than the last phase. So in other words, it's very easy to just patch things up. That can go quite quickly. It's very easy to rebuild like for like, but it gets exponentially harder to do major reconstruction, to do betterment, and to do change. So if you're trying to actually infuse change, you have to come up with ways in which you can do that within these constraints that we've already talked about: time compression and government structure. So this is just context, but if you are interested in reading our book, it's not a shameless plug, but it's available for free download. And there's a short version and a long version at the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. The reason I wanted to share that is really just to say, across all those countries and all those cases that we've looked at, we did find that there were these 4 factors that really were what we would consider sort of the levers that you can pull for recovery management. And that is managing money well, managing and increasing information flows amongst all those actors, really supporting collaboration and coordination among all those actors and stakeholders, and balancing time, using time just like you want to think about money as an asset or information as an asset, using time also as an asset, and thinking strategically about how you manage time and manage that issue of time compression. So what's going on right now in LA that if we're going to try to infuse betterment into the process, we need to know sort of the lay of the land? Well, the big thing that's been going on over the last 20 years, and especially since Hurricane Katrina, is the formalization of disaster recovery. It started at the national level, where Congress directed FEMA and HUD to figure out how all federal agencies could play better in the sandbox of post-disaster recovery. We're now into the 3rd edition of our National Disaster Recovery Framework. And in that framework, they identified what are called recovery support functions. California has adopted this structure, and those 6 recovery support functions, there are lead agencies at the federal level and at the state level, and there is now a hierarchy of structure that actually sits around that. So those functions are community planning and capacity building. So there's like one group over here doing that. It's separate from economy, housing, health and social services, infrastructure systems, and natural and cultural resources. So you can see there who's coordinating that. The point I'm trying to bring here too is that if you're trying to infuse betterment, we don't work on betterment sometimes as planners in these silos. We need to actually have that vision of betterment and that policy about land use and things kind of affecting all of these. So that becomes a challenge. Where are we right now? Back to that timeline. The state emergency plan now incorporates the California Disaster Recovery Framework. So we sort of have one agency, Cal OES, leading with one document, the state emergency plan. We are transitioned from the National Response Framework and SIMS, the Standardized Emergency Management Structure, which all local agencies are required to use. So all this stuff that we're required to do for response, we're now moving into something that's a little bit more loose, not required, which is the National Disaster Recovery Framework, the State Recovery Framework, and local and cities needing to be brought into the fold of that. And so just touching base with a few state people today, they said some of the task forces are in the process of transitioning from being emergency management task forces to the recovery support functions. So as an example, there's a joint state local housing long-term recovery task force, but right now they're still very focused on those more immediate needs of having people sign up for individual assistance and sheltering. There is now something much more formalized that's really come about in about the last 5 to 10 years, which is called a recovery interagency coordination structure. So there's a federal disaster recovery coordinator. There are state disaster recovery coordinators too. So they're working across these different recovery support functions, and they're supposed to be talking to each other and bringing in the county and the city. According to some state contacts, we are in the process of doing something, completing something called a recovery needs assessment. And their view is that it's actually quite robust. And this is basically all of those recovery support functions looking at what the recovery needs are and beginning to translate those into a set of projects. So there is time to infuse betterment and policy, but it's working within this structure that it has to happen. And that's what I really wanted to communicate. So one of the things back to that timeline about this is that if you want to really achieve betterment, then we have to recognize that we need to actually take time to plan for that. And one of the things I like to map against this and sharing this with local officials is that public participation, like the public participation spectrum, you could almost lay it out across this timeline. That if you're just replacing like for like, then you can use speed to do that. You can inform, you can consult, but if you want to do change, you really need to involve people more. You need to collaborate, you need to empower. And that's really because you don't understand in a time compressed environment, you don't understand all the interdependencies. So policy that you make in that sort of narrow tunnel view that you have actually may not understand all the cascading effects of policy change. And I could talk forever about some examples of where we've seen that problem happen. But I'll also say, just in closing, that one of the ways that I've been thinking about this and helping governments begin to structure their recovery management is to actually, here this is in Wellington, but what we're showing is over there, they have something similar to recovery support functions on the left. They call them environments. But we said there's actually some services that need to funnel into all of those, one of which we called innovation and risk reduction, so that you would actually have a designated service, just like financing or communication or planning and information, GIS management, a function, a person who is in an office that is really there to actually vet new ideas, creative ideas, innovation, and try to infuse it into the process. And that's a concept they're trying to work on down in Wellington. It's also something that's been brought up in doing some pre-disaster recovery organizational design here in the US. So the last slide I'd just say is that as planners, the way we've talked about this, Rob and I have talked about the way you can sort of begin to deliberate and act simultaneously. Really, there are sort of different ways we can do that. We've observed all of these in different disasters. One is just by hiring a ton more people and, putting more planners out on the street. Another is to sort of set up a structure and then decentralize the process. And another is to actually take the easy stuff first and iterate, and keep digging into what's harder and harder and sort of laying that out in a transparent way so people know that, the tough stuff is coming and we're going to work on that over time. And I just would close with one example of how that was done in Louisiana, where they essentially worked at multiple levels, working on infusing resilience into actual pattern books for rebuilding houses and businesses, to working with neighborhoods, working at the city level, city simultaneously, one city for another city, and then also putting a regional plan together to kind of pull all that policy making together. These things didn't happen in a linear sequence, they happen simultaneously. And I'll stop there and turn it over to Jennifer. We can't hear you, Jennifer. I think you're on
I'm
mute.
so sorry, Lori. It's so nice to actually be here with you in particular, because you showed up in my community and you were really the only person who knew anything about this stuff that came consistently over and over again. And it's not that we took all of the advice that we should have probably taken, to be clear, but you were really like, you underestimate the impact on our community when you showed up. And I know that I sat in a lot of meetings and it was like, oh, look, there's somebody who has an idea. And that was really important. It was grounded in fact and truth. And so when I'm watching you, talk about all these things on this webinar, it feels wonderfully full circle to me. And I really appreciate it. And I just wanted you to know that, like, full support. So I'm Jennifer Gray Thompson. I'm the CEO and founder of a nonprofit called After the Fire USA. Our primary function is to help newly fire-affected communities navigate mega fires and then to stay with them through the span of their recovery. Our model is really showing up early and being very helpful and like helping them steward their recovery, and then to really fold them into our vast network of mega fire survivors and experts so that they can go to the next fire with me. So I'm going to share a slide deck and walk through. Oh, right. For some reason, it didn't share. Okay, thank you. Wrong page. I'm going to start here. Bear with me. I've been, okay. So this is me. Thank you. So what do we do? Our main function is empowering communities to navigate the era of mega fires. We come at this from a definitely community perspective, and like what Lori was talking about, in our view, if you can center the community and listen to them, it's actually incredibly efficient and you get better information. We are the leading nonprofit organization helping mega fire affected communities, and our mission is to really help guide them through the complex journey. As you know, it's very destabilizing emotionally, physically, in so many ways. And if we are there along with them, the number one thing that we hear is that we are able to bring them hope. And how do we do that? Well, what sets us apart is that we are from a community that has recovered. And where I live in Sonoma County, we were pretty much entirely rebuilt in 5 years, maybe about 7% not rebuilt. In every disaster, there are always stragglers who will probably never rebuild, or they just are taking extra time. We lost 8,900 structures across 4 counties. Sonoma County lost about 5,900. And again, rebuilt for a variety of reasons. I'm always trying to get people to understand that pre-existing conditions before the disaster absolutely in so many ways determine post-fire, and any way that we can help them to navigate the barriers and challenges to recovery is very important. And one of the reasons why we are so trusted is because we've lived through these challenges and we are actively still navigating recovery. What do? We deploy, we bring delegations. We've been to LA twice. I've been there 3 times so far. I just got back yesterday again. And we meet with a lot of nonprofits. We gave them a system called block captains. I'm going to talk about that. It's not for everyone. It was for this particular community. We engage in advocacy, mostly at the federal level, including last year being the point guard in so many ways on passing HR 5863, which brought $6 billion worth of relief, taxpayer relief for people who are undergoing or have undergone disaster. That was very important to us. What we do is we listen to disaster survivors, and then we decide all of our programming from there. We do a lot of education, including convening wildfire survivors and leaders once a year at our summit. It's called a Wildfire Leadership Summit, so that's pretty obvious. And then we really encourage innovation. We're all, none of us want to do this over and over and over again. And the thing about mega fire that I like, even though that sounds weird, is that it is in many ways more solvable than many of the other peril and climate issues. There's many things that we know from science that we can do so that the conflagration that happens in these urban and even rural communities from house to house to house is not a given. We can actually build back, and in a way that's far more resilient through like IBHS, Wildfire Prepared Home. You all are planners out there, so I know that you know this, and I appreciate you so much. Our goal is that our communities are stronger and more sustainable. The state of disaster in America, as you know, it's rough. And right now I just have to acknowledge that right now we are in a very awkward place of many people wanting to rid us of FEMA altogether. And that is based upon both false assumptions, but also just the need for recovery is absolutely accurate though. Just to give you an idea, for those of you who don't dive normally deep into recovery, before, this is pre-Helene, this is actually pre-LA fires. In the 10-year period, we had 173 separate billion-dollar events, costing about $1.2 trillion. But in 2023, we had 28, including the Maui fires, which was the deadliest, not the worst, but really the deadliest mega fire disaster in 100 years. In 2024, we had 63 as of October 1st. And so I think, it could be a bump here, but we don't know. And now here we are, we have the Los Angeles fires. The cost is estimated to be $250 billion. So clearly we need everybody at the table, especially planners. I did want to point out that in the 7 years since Lori so kindly came to my community, we have worked in all of these communities, and all of these communities have needed services, which means that in megafire, we've actually increased the incidence of megafire by 250% in 10 years. So all of these across these 4 states, we couldn't make it into Washington in 2020 because of COVID. We went as far as we could in a rented RV, but this is an increasing problem. The photo over here, by the way, on the right is of Josiah Nishida is in the center. He's the county manager for Maui. And then next to him is Tim Carpenter from Fannie Mae. We have Valerie Brown, who's with us. She is an insurance and recovery expert. This one, we brought people from 5 different fires to meet with newly fire affected people. This is the Eaton fire. The most important thing we do is deploy. We go places, we meet people, we listen, we talk to them, and then we figure out who to bring next, what to bring them next. We're very much a giant group project, and our job is really just to coordinate and listen to what people want and need, and then continue to have those conversations and provide resources. Our main deliverable, honestly, is people. It's a huge gift. Like when people are in crisis, they can reach for books. And it's rare to have a book like Rob and Lori's that's so useful and that you can actually go and find. But sometimes what you need is a person to tell you that that book is there, because your brain is so addled from having this horrible thing happen. And so having a person there that says, oh, well, here, I've already vetted this for you. This is something that you can and should read. This is worth your time, your very precious time after a disaster. Here's the Pacific Palisades fire. We've been on 2 tours there now, and it really is a huge challenge for sure, but we're very optimistic for them. And we do believe they have the talent and the resources in both Eaton and Pacific Palisades to recover. But this is going to be a game changer fire, especially with respect to rebuilding and insurability. They have to not only be insurable, but we think they could be the model for insurability. A couple of things, it's one of the things that they've loved the most there that I've taken. So I look at every fire and I go, okay, who can I bring? What are they interested in? And right away they were interested in block captains, which is a system that we used here. It's a basic community organizing system, and this harkens back to exactly what Lori was talking about. If you can get good information through a good system of people actually navigating it and this goes on for many, many, many years, then you are so much more efficient, and then you don't make bad policy. And I'm so glad that Lori mentioned that, because we see bad policy pop up often as a reaction, because people are like, somebody needs to do something. And it's really important that they listen to the block captains. This is our first convening in 2019. And at the table is Paradise, Woolsey Fire, let's see, campfire, oops, sorry, a campfire, Tubbs fire, and then all of the fires of the North Bay. And this is part of what we do, is we just share our information over and over. These are some of the work that we do in Mendocino County. Most people don't know that that was also the worst natural disaster in their history. And so we worked with John Kennedy here so that he could have a volunteer, actually not a volunteer. He took people who were laid off from the cannabis industry once it became legal, you know what I mean, and retrained them to be construction workers because they needed that. Here's another example in the Almeda fire in Southern Oregon, where we have a fire survivor. Actually, there were 100 units here, 110 units, 100 burned down, and they were single units for a manufactured home park. We're here with Fannie Mae, as well as Charles Brooks from Rebuild Paradise Foundation. And we're listening to the problems that they are incurring, which has actually ended up being really pivotal, because this gentleman was being charged rent even when his home was not habitable. And so sometimes we uncover unethical practices, and we can help with that too. So that's another point of advocacy. We spend a lot of time, really focusing on what other places have done to deal with issues like the housing market after disaster is always very challenging. We always see illegal evictions. One of the things they're trying to do in LA more successfully is really expose what happens to communities when people engage in unscrupulous practices. We advocate in DC, as I mentioned earlier. This is once again, I'm talking to a senator's office. I believe this was Cassidy's office, about the need for to listen to the community, what they needed. And these are just more. We do a lot of national news on this subject too. Testified in front of the Senate last year on the need to codify block grant funding. And then I sit on a disaster response reform task force at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm not sure how relevant that's going to remain. And again, we just make a big effort to always focus on when you see the people on the bottom right, those are fire survivors. And so every day when we're walking through whatever we do, we always center fire survivors, and that's the most important thing. Educate, conferences, whatever we can do. We also have a podcast because I thought we might fold during COVID. So anywhere we can go, I'm like an evangelical person for this. And this is we flew 30 people out from Maui this year to our Wildfire Leadership Summit to participate, but also to share their lessons of aloha. That was actually really beautiful. It was a really wonderful experience. 190 of us in a room. We do put this on our YouTube channel. And then we had them go to a neighborhood that had actually rebuilt here in Santa Rosa. And these are leaders from Lahaina and fire survivors meeting with people with the fees who rebuilt in this particular neighborhood. We love innovation. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. I just want to point out that this work for us, we depend on planners, we depend on the community, but we also depend on people like John Clark Mills, who invented watch duty, which exploded during the Eaton and Palisades fire in use. So we encourage all innovation, and we have participated in it. I'm trying to go quickly through here. People need to know new ways to build, and I think planners can be really helpful here. There's a huge lack of information, and how do you rebuild? What's the science? And down on the bottom right, you see IBHS's research facility. And this is my big message, is that we can actually do this. And I'll leave you with this. Unlike cynicism, hopefulness is hard-earned, makes demands upon us, and can often feel like the most indefensible and lonely place on earth. Hopefulness is not a neutral position either. It is adversarial. It is the warrior emotion that can lay waste to cynicism. It says that the world and its inhabitants have value and are worth defending. It says the world is worth believing in. In time, we come to find that it is so. And that is how we think of everything at After the Fire. And thank you for having me.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We just got a ton of information from the two of you. I think we get the idea. Recovery is a complicated business. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people involved, and in a very fast-moving time environment. But there are a lot of ways in which we can make sense of it. And hopefully we can get to some of that. So I have a few questions here, and I have at least one on the from the chat right now. But let me just start with kind of the big planning question, which is that, you know, some officials have said that there's this is no time for planning, because it by doing planning, it's only going to slow things down. So how do we respond to that kind of comment?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that some of what I was trying to show is that you really will have both. You know, there are waves of recovery to some extent. I see the planning process, especially in this early stage of recovery, as really being about that needs assessment, understanding the issues. And yes, there's already people who are highly capitalized who want to rebuild exactly what they had, who know. I think the first researchers, Rob and I often quote their quote that says, everybody has a plan for recovery. It's what they had before, you know, and they will fight vehemently to get it back. And so, you know, it's very hard, I think, especially in fires, compared to a flood where land is gone, you know, it's actually washed away, or an earthquake where the ground is so muddled and munted, they called it in New Zealand, but with liquefaction, landslides, rock falls, whatever, that it's very hard to rebuild right away. That it's very hard with fires to say you can't rebuild here. And I think often people see a blank slate, which is absolutely not true. But if you are going to have really big questions like, are we going to relocate people? I think you have to really show that leadership early in the process and actually prohibit redevelopment and start a planning process. I don't think you can do it simultaneous with people with all this built up, you know, energy and funding to rebuild. So that's the real challenge. You know, when people are completely unable to get back into an area, you can sometimes start that planning and and people will want to, or they don't have the means to rebuild. And those conversations will start early. But unless you put that policy in place ahead of time, I think it's really hard to start that. Now, I will finish by saying that it is, once you begin to understand what the challenges are for people in rebuilding and where the problems are for people, then you can start that conversation, because there will be people who want to sell, there will be people who don't have the means, and you can solve those in different ways by finding additional resources if we want to rebuild back, but also by helping to create buyout programs and other things. So it is possible to do it, but I think it's hard to do it if you haven't started the policy making ahead of time to do it quickly in a big way. Otherwise, you're doing more incremental change over time.
I think it's why it's important that people who are experienced in planning to come, that you can see the overview, and other people are sort of reacting to all of the stress of what's happening. The thing about the LA fires is that these people are incredible doers. Everyone's a doer, but these people are very, very, they're all producers in some way. And I don't know that I've ever seen a community almost overly organized and yet unorganized, and yet miss big gaps. So we're working on that with them right now. Like, that's a good job for our organization. They've done a pretty cool thing, which is create this thing called Department of Angels, which actually exists to support all of the community groups that have formed, especially block captains in particular, and listen to them and then try to elevate what they need so that they're all rising together. I will say that this fire also will have an unprecedented amount of smoke damage. And so that's something that we've never seen this much before. And then how do you mitigate, for that? And also it needs to be counted so that we can use it as a future data point too in recovery. I haven't seen any real discussion around buyouts. I actually don't think that will happen in this particular fire, either of them. I think that when the buyouts happen, it'll be through land trusts or there'll be land banking. People, like especially from in Maui and in LA, and Altadena in particular, are very sensitive to any topic of coming up of that whatsoever. And so we're trying to pivot them more towards thinking about, okay, if you go back, what does that look like? And how can we make sure that you are safe and you are insurable, and that you understand the community, like the soft infrastructure of how to evacuate also has to go with that same plan. And it's a hard thing to do right now when there is so much information and not all of it is great information. And so all of us are navigating infoverses, and that's definitely factoring in here.
So I think both of you sort of touched on it, that there might be some opportunities for the communities to be able to create some community-wide benefits for themselves. And I know both of you have spent time down there too. So both given experience from previous events, as well as knowing what we know to this point about what some of the people are organizing for in LA, what are some of the ways in which they might be able to, in all of this time compressed rebuilding environment, what are some of the ways in which they might be able to make various kinds of improvements? You're muted, Jennifer.
I know. I just was saying, would you want to go first, Lori? No. Oh, there's so many ways they can make improvements. Like, disasters are terrible, but we always encourage the reimagining of what's possible and to take what previous, so Paradise is a completely different fire, but people often look at it and they're like, oh, here's the number for the fire for LA fires. Here's the number for Paradise. They must be the same. And I'm like, they could not be more different in their conditions for how they're going to recover. There's just so many differences. I can't even begin them right now, but I can say that there are certain things that Paradise has done really well. Like, they're the first fire community that we've seen actually get a reduction in their insurance costs dramatically, because they invited Mercury Insurance into their community to say, here's what we're doing. What do you think? And Mercury was so impressed. They said, yep, we're going to take part of this into our portfolio, what we can afford, and then we're going to reduce it. We're talking by like 80% based upon the fact that they have like a gravel program where they can, through Rebuild Paradise Foundation. There are so many small iterative differences that are major, major impact that we see. We see pretty much everyone I've dealt with in LA, and I've dealt with a lot of the groups now, like a lot of the groups. They know they have to rebuild back differently. They know they have to live differently. They understand it. But I hear a continued dedication to making sure that they can go home, but they understand that's going to look different. But in between here and there is that community-wide effort. And we see the same amount of organization on both sides. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but we are trying to make sure the biggest barrier we have right now is organizing the organizers, to be honest. Like, they're highly organized. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Jennifer said. I think, because of Jennifer's organizations, also just the tremendous amount of loss when Jennifer showed, whatever the 10 events, which someone else also wanted to note that the North Complex fire of August 17, 2020 needs to be on the list. That maybe it was, but we've been looking at this problem in the state, and the insurance crisis has kind of come together, with the wildfire phenomena. And there have been efforts through CAL FIRE, through the Institute of Building and Home Safety, to really come up with a standard for what rebuilding looks like, and will be more resilient. And I think the notion of rebuilding insurability is so prevalent in everyone's mind because of the insurance crisis, that I don't think people want to build less than a resilient, they want to build a more resilient structure, whether they're in a high severity fire zone or not. So I feel pretty confident that that can be done. I will say, though, that one of the things, I'm actually on a commission that Supervisor Horvath created, which is supposed to be an independent kind of, I think, as Jennifer said, sometimes you just need people to point out the important stuff. So we're trying to infuse sort of the best practice and knowledge. So IBHS is on that committee, and others, to really talk about a resilient fire recovery, and what do we need to do in energy, in water, in governance and finance, in community restoration, land use, building standards, and disaster prevention response are sort of our topical areas. So the point I wanted to make in that is that the other pieces of this, of making sure, like getting that stuff into the process is really the challenge. How do you get that when you've got this entire bureaucratic sort of machine pushing forward? And I will say there was a question that came to us in the chat, which I'm going to pivot to now to talk about what happens if we don't get the federal dollars. Part of what's happening with all of that structure, that collaboration of FEMA and Cal OES and the structure I showed you, is really to make sure that we maximize the dollars that are already available to us through that presidential disaster declaration. So they are pushing people to get people signed up for individual assistance, to make sure that we get all the sheltering funds that we're entitled to under a presidential disaster declaration, that we start to do our public assistance applications for all of our damaged infrastructure. So Governor Newsom sent a letter saying, you know, we want to make sure 40 billion is available to us. That 40 billion that he had in his letter is really about maximizing. That's the needs assessment of what should be available to us already under a presidential disaster declaration. So then there's another phase we have to do beyond that, which is, you know, if we want to go to higher levels of performance, if we want to build back more resilient infrastructure, we need hazard mitigation money, we need money coming through the community development block grant. Those are supplemental, that's a supplemental request. Programming the hazard mitigation money, it will come to us hopefully as part of the presidential disaster declaration, but it needs to be programmed. And that's kind of what the recovery needs assessment is trying to do right now, is at least quickly understand what all those things are and how do we actually put that picture together quickly so people can advocate for that supplemental grant and make sure that we get the hazard mitigation money and the rest of money obligated to us under the presidential disaster declaration. So we can't do a lot of this resilience without those funds.
I just want to piggyback on what Lori is saying. We love the Blue Ribbon Commission. We think Supervisor Horvath is doing a great job in leadership. Leadership after disaster is not for everyone, but clearly she is a person that can really do this and is doing it well. We like it a lot. But we are in absolutely unknown territory. Like we've never seen it like this before. We've seen some you know, leveraging in 2017 and 2018, but not to this degree. And we're very concerned. And we feel at this point, we won't be able to really count on any of that until the flip, the House and the Senate. And I'm not being biased politically here. I'm just talking about the actual political landscape, what it looks like. Oddly enough, you know, I see a lot of my colleagues and our colleagues who are talking on LinkedIn in particular about here's what we should do with FEMA, here's how this should go. And I hope that there is an appetite to actually listening to the people who've been working in that field for so long and really have expertise. I'm just concerned and not terribly optimistic for the time being, but it will be, you know, factoring into all of our advice and all of our counsel in this fire is that we probably won't see anything for 2 years, and that then it has to be appropriated and then has to go through HCD at the state level, and HCD, bless their hearts, can slow things down by a year or longer.
Yeah, so we're talking about community development block grant money. So yeah, Congress has to act first, however long that's going to take. And then it goes to HUD, which is in the process of getting its staff drastically reduced. So yeah, some of that may get here, but it'll take some time.
But Rob, just to finish,
yeah,
please. The $40 billion that Governor Newsom is requesting is what's already should be available to us under the Stafford Act. So that's not new money that needs to be requested, but money that we should see. And the concern is not so much, I mean, yeah, there's the supplemental, but the concern is that this might be something where that money doesn't come, like a lot of programs right now at the federal level where money was already obligated, but it's not actually coming out, you know, USAID being kind of one of the most visible, but, you know, people have already incurred those expenses and they're not being reimbursed for them. So that's what that 40 billion is about, is just making sure that what we've already incurred and know should be available to us under the presidential disaster declaration actually makes it here.
Right, but it needs to go through administrative actions in order to finally show up. Yeah. Oh, good. Anyway, I'm glad so two of you jumped to get that question. I have one more here, and then there's another I'm going to pull out of the chat. So both the state and the local governments have been certainly to this point, emphasizing permit streamlining. And really, you know, most of what burned in both Altadena and Pacific Palisades were single family homes. And so, you know, the emphasis is on streamlining in order to facilitate private reconstruction of those homes, which obviously is really an important thing to do. But is there anything important that's missing in this approach that's not getting out there in the conversation and in emphasis on policy?
You want to go, Lori, and I can go after you?
Sure, I'll say a couple of things. I think one of the real things that we're still trying to get our heads around is that, you know, Altadena was not in a high fire severity zone. So if they want to rebuild to Chapter 7A, the WUI building code, there's no trigger to require that at this point in time. So that becomes more voluntary. And that's a challenge because insurance has constraints on, there's funds in your insurance policy up to your limits to actually pay for what's called law and ordinance. So it's really any additional, you know, if your house was built in 1960 and you need to comply with upgraded building codes, be it plumbing, electrical, everything, but also wildfire resilience, then that's what that coverage is for, within your policy. But if government streamlines and doesn't actually put those requirements in place, then it becomes harder to get that paid for by insurers. So that's one thing that speeding up, you know, we can overlook that we're actually undermining some of the criteria of different funding streams. Similarly, there are all sorts of rules on repairing infrastructure that get complicated like that as well. So one of the things our group is trying to do is just really unravel the legal issues around what's in insurance contracts, what's in CEQA, what's in you know, other FEMA regulations in the Federal Register, and make sure that policymakers are aware of these so that, you know, streamlining doesn't overlook a chance for a pot of money to be available. So that's one thing we want to get aligned right now. And then the other issue I think that's really present in people's minds is public health. And, you know, Jennifer can jump in and talk about this, but it really is, for many people, like you said, the smoke issue is huge. And so it's about soil related safety standards, water related safety standards, groundwater, water coming through piping systems that might have had damage. And then also air quality inside homes, you know, on a permanent basis. And so I know last night I attended a public health town hall that the county put on that was multi-agency. We had feds, states, locals, we had academic experts on there. That was really an excellent communication device, but we also, again, need that direction and standard to hold like the insurers to that standard for their evaluation, because really a claims adjuster is coming with their own experience, what they've done in the past. And unless there's a clear standard out there, then you're going to see, and you can already see it in different, you know, talking with different neighborhood groups in one condominium area, you know, even the same company, different adjusters were giving different advice to people. And that's the kind of thing that has to be coordinated better and communicated on, and it requires leadership to get that done. But those are the issues right now that I think are really prevalent in people's mind, is making sure that it's safe to return and that there's some standards for that, and making sure that money is available to do the resilience work that people already know they need to do in order to be insurable.
I'm going to go backwards on that because I just want to make sure that I would talk about the adjuster issue really quickly. This is another reason why organizing into block captains is so helpful, because you should be talking to your neighbor to say, like, what did they say about your condo versus my condo, and why is there such a huge diversity and huge wide range of what our claims should be. The other thing to really be careful of, which is something we are concerned about in Los Angeles with so many jurisdictions, is making sure that the county and the cities actually collaborate and don't institute different rules. Because as soon as they do, it's bad. And we saw this on a much smaller level, but in the Marshall Fire in Colorado. So you had Louisville, you had Superior, and then you had unincorporated Boulder County. They had three different ways or sets of rules for recovery and rebuilding. And we stood there when neighbors argued with each other on the street, and we understood where one would say, I want to build back in a way that's very fire safe, that's peril safe, all of it very, very resiliently. And then the other neighbor said, well, that's going to increase my cost. That means that I can't come home if that's the rule. So you must not want me to come home. And the other person said, well, I can't live next door to you unless you do the same thing that I'm doing. What they found was that if the state put money through, like an extra $5,000 to $10,000, and they worked with the community foundation, that they could augment some of those costs. And I think that that's a really great opportunity. So they did a great job with that, and most people did build back to the highest standard. However, it has slowed the recovery for Louisville, that Superior took a different route. And it caused a lot of consternation and a lot of drama that just did not have to. It was unnecessary. I love them. I work with all of them, but even they would tell you that it is so important that they collaborate on what the rules are going to be and what the opportunities are to really augment those costs.
Great, thanks. I'm going to make sure that we have one question out there on the chat that I want to make sure we get to, from Jane Riley, saying, I'd like to hear more in the future about land banking as part of recovery and resiliency. So is there anything that you can say about that?
Well, Jennifer probably has more details on this, but I know there is a real push to do this right now in Altadena in particular. And there are a number of issues that are sort of coming together to create a level of energy I haven't seen in some other events. Often the land banking and the buyout program is initiated like through the National Flood Insurance Program. So there's like a trigger and a funding stream already. In this case, it has to all kind of be constructed from scratch. But you have generational ownership and people who, didn't have a mortgage, and so they didn't have insurance requirements. And if, if they couldn't afford insurance had gone up, whatever reason, they might not have had any other reason, any other trigger or pressure to have it, and so thus may not have had insurance. There's underinsurance. Especially, for older homes where people, again, might have been handed down, and they just don't have the amount of insurance to actually rebuild at the level, at the cost of today's dollars for construction. And then the third category is just elderly people, and that exists in Palisades too, who are now sort of getting their head around, do I really want to spend the next 5 to 10 years of my life working on a rebuilding process? So I think those three things in Altadena in particular are coming together in a pretty strong way. And there's a group of attorneys who are working on setting up a land bank and getting the various players lined up, financiers, the actual receiver, the banker of the land, and then the structure in which the community would engage on what happens with those properties after they are bought. So right now, that's what I know of that. I guess my personal view is that I think unless you have triggers like the National Flood Insurance programs, or in other countries they have similar things, we really need to create some sort of mechanism like this in advance of disasters, so that it's easier for communities to begin to do this stuff, because it's very hard to stand this thing up, and especially to stand it up completely outside of government after a disaster.
I appreciate that. We're hearing community land trust and land banking. There's two experts from Fannie Mae that we brought into a meeting, but it was a little too early, and I think they weren't ready to hear it. But really the goal is how not to enable predators to come, which is the same thing we see in every fire, but in particular with Altadena and then also with Lahaina. And you can see the struggle in Lahaina that they very much want to keep. They've been very protective there from the state, federal, and local government. And the community land trust for Lahaina popped up after the fires, and I think they have one parcel so far, but it's so hard to do, Lori. I totally agree with you. After, it's entirely possible, and I'm hoping that whatever they create here in for Altadena is we can use it in other places and see how that goes, or it can be the argument for a change of policy. I think one of the things that concerned me early on was talking to a retired lawmaker who wanted to find a way for California to end up owning all of those non-contiguous lots where people did not want to rebuild on. And I'm like, I don't even know how that would work, because fire is just not the same as other perils. And so I agree that there are really smart people in the world. There's Lori Schumann is in the room with you. She's on that same panel with you, which I love her so much. She's great at this stuff. There are very smart people in the room. The desired outcome is not to push, especially the Black home ownership, which is a point of pride in Altadena and should be, to make sure that there are mechanisms to keep them there, to preserve what's really wonderful about Altadena. But we are very concerned about the number of predators, and many are disguising themselves as not predators, and it's working, unfortunately, for some of them.
Yeah. So, and also everything you guys just said, obviously the HUD money would help as well, if that should come. So my last sort of overall question here, which I think you led nicely up to, is how can we, and particularly we as planners, help to ensure that all of the various members of Pacific Palisades and Altadena communities are given the opportunity to rejoin those communities? A big question.
One of the first things that is a problem in disasters is just knowing where people go to. And right now, I think most people are staying fairly close in the LA area from what people know, but it's still anecdotal. The only people who know where people is FEMA and insurance companies, and that data is not possible to get for privacy protection reasons. And so one thing we as planners who work in government could do is just create voluntary registries. And people are already connected through various social networks. So working with those social networks to actually connect to their lists of people, I think that, the foundation of all people participating in the dialogue requires some infrastructure on our part, and we know how to do that. We do that in community engagement processes all the time, and we need to help LA City, LA County, and the other jurisdictions with this task as well, so that all people are reached and engaged in the recovery effort.
And my job is to help you do that. My job is to listen to your barriers and figure out how we can be of service to making sure that everybody is actually participating. We think that it's the best research and development on the planet, and anything that we can do in order to support the planners and all of this, we will absolutely do. And thank you so much.
Great. Well, with that, we're at time, and of course, we've answered all of the questions in 1 hour here. Anyway, thank you very much. This was really great. And I'll turn it over to Mark to take us home.
All right, Lori and Jennifer, thank you so much for the information you provided. And Rob, thanks for a great job moderating. And just for everybody who might know somebody who was interested in this but didn't get a chance to hop on right while we're doing this, the recording of this presentation is available on the California APA website under the LA Fire tab. And so in addition to that, the previous sessions are on there as well. And we'll have upcoming sessions listed on there, as well as documents and other resources that we are gathering as a part of Cal APA's efforts here. So we want to thank everybody who tuned in today. We do have several upcoming series here. There's going to be one essentially more on a technical note about the kinds of things that you can do to encourage folks to go above the minimum as far as building back more resilient. We'll bring in building officials and architects, talk about those particular issues there. And as you heard today, the planner's role on that is to think about sort of how we as a profession are helping the regulatory framework so that some of those things that are nice to haves become must haves, and that brings funding a lot of times. So we do have a role in our profession here, and the earlier we do that and the more comprehensively we think through these issues, the easier it will build to build back better. Because for a lot of folks, they really do have the goal of getting back into their property and having it be quite similar to what they had before. But of course, we know the best indicator of where a mass fire is going to happen is if you've had a mass fire. And of course, we have all had several areas in the state where we've now on the second or third major urban fire in an area that had historically burned when there weren't residences there. So thinking about this always from the perspective of we're preparing for the next time, not just building back what we had before. I want to thank everybody who tuned in, and we will be putting the schedule out. We've got several things coming up. We're about on a 2-week schedule here, so do check the website, and for those who've signed up, they can get pinged as well. I want to thank everybody who participated today. Wish you a great weekend, and touch back with us here in a couple of weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.